It's an atmosphere thing.
Hello again, Professor. We're going to go now into an area of your testimony that seems to me to be one in which you move from your calculations of present value and you run those calculations into a model that effectively produces these theoretical annuities. Is that more or less where you're going next?
Yes.
Okay, so why don't we develop that? Then you start with a reference to the Court of Appeal on slide 114.
Thank you.
Yes, that's exactly right. So far we've been talking about NCRs, either in nominal terms or in present value terms. Now I would like to talk about annuities and our approach to calculating hypothetical annuities, repeating what Mr. Marcellus said. So our starting point is the Court of Appeal decision from stage one. Read just a few selected words. I know they're well known to everyone here. This guides us. The court determined that, quote, the Crown is obligated to increase the promised annuity payment if NCRs from the treaty territory permit the Crown to do so without incurring loss. So that is our starting point. That decision, however, in my view, doesn't offer any specific guidance on the practical questions about augmented annuities. Doesn't tell us when they would have been increased or by how much for any given pattern of NCRs. Doesn't say what the augmented annuities should have been. And so we are proposing a specific mechanism of how augmentation would have operated. In our view, it's consistent with the court's guidance that I've just quoted. It's consistent with the historical record of annuities and augmentations in the past. And in our view, based on economic principles, we feel that it respects the interests of the Anishinaabe annuitants and of their collective treaty rights as we understand them as economists through an economic lens. So that's what we're doing. On the next slide, 115.
I was going to say here, I'm sorry if you want to go right ahead. I just had a point of clarification here. You
Of course, please.
On 115, so you are here, I guess, distinguishing between NCRs and annuities, and Mr. Hutchings' view of using NCRs and your idea of creating a special account within the CRF. This is where we are now, right, roughly?
Right, having
Okay.
made that distinction between NCRs and annuities, which to my recollection, that distinction was never discussed in the reports by Hutchings and Stiglitz. I may stand corrected on that, but wasn't certainly central to their discussions of these issues. We're going to make that distinction in a practical way.
So go ahead then with slide 115.
So carrying on from that observation, what I see in Mr. Hutchings' report is that he simply assumes that some share of NCRs, there's, for example, a discussion of an 84% share in his report. So some share of NCRs, as they are received by the Crown each year, they would, in his view, have been paid out immediately to the annuitants. Again, hypothetically, if the augmentation clause had operated as the court is interpreting it, that's his view of augmentation. I think that Professor Stiglitz assumes the same in his model, where he talks about not sharing NCRs, but sharing the underlying resource rents. He also thinks that those amounts would hypothetically have been paid year by year. And the term I'll use to describe that alternative model discussed by the plaintiff experts is the joint venture model. That's what they call it. We don't think the joint venture model is an accurate depiction of that alternative reality in which annuities would have been augmented by the Crown in the past. Professor Bodway will speak more about the joint venture model, since by agreement, his job is to respond to the plaintiff's experts and contrast our views. But to motivate our own approach to this, I'll make a couple of references to the joint venture model to contrast it. So what do we think would happen? In our approach, instead of paying out NCRs year by year to the annuitants in the way I just described as being the plaintiff experts approach, in our opinion, instead, the Crown would have done the following. They would have measured treaty NCRs year by year and then recorded some share of that NCR amount in a special account within the CRF. So the revenues would come in, the net revenues would come into the CRF, and an accounting exercise would have been done to say, this share of it will be devoted to the Vidal Anderson, as we're going to call it, the Vidal Anderson annuity account. And that account would have existed within the CRF.
Okay.
Then we think the Crown would have paid interest on the capital in that annuity account to the Anishinaabe annuitants each year. So the distinction I'm making is between paying out the NCRs, which I just called capital,
Excuse me.
which I just called capital as they accumulate over time, and paying out interest on the NCRs, or the cumulative sum of past NCRs. So this alternative approach that we're proposing, we call in our report, we call it the Vidal Anderson approach to augmentation. There's a reason for that. We believe it's supported by historical evidence, and I'll offer some observations on that in just a few minutes.
So you say the NCRRs being put into a special account within the CRF would be treated as assets and the interest generated would be paid out. Do I have that right?
Yes, Your Honor, I'm just cautious in the use of the word assets, which can
Oh.
have different meanings in
Okay.
different contexts. But we think, just as we see in other aspects of the public accounts, there would have been one account devoted to funding and computing the value of the augmented annuities to be paid out.
Okay. That one count devoted to funding and computing is also the account holding the NCRRs,
That account,
or it's just an accounting, it's just an accounting exercise.
this is an accounting exercise which does have real consequences for the way in which annuities would be calculated and paid. But I am trying to describe our notion of the accounting the Crown would have engaged in, Crown officials would have engaged in the past.
Okay, thank you.
And on slide 116, you begin to develop your rationale for the Vidal Anderson approach, Professor.
Right, so we think that the Vidal Anderson approach is a better approach than the joint venture approach of paying out NCRs. We think that's true first based on economic principles. So economic principles favor this Vidal Anderson approach I'm describing, chiefly because, as we have seen, those annual NCRs in the treaty territory, whether as estimated by ourselves or by Mr. Hutchings, they're volatile, meaning that they rise and fall considerably from year to year. Some years they're high, some years low, whether you take the Hutchings estimates or the Bodway Smart estimates. So that's what we mean by volatile. The problem with paying out these volatile annual NCRs to annuitants is that it would have exposed the annuitants to income risk. So if their annuity income was the NCRs, then their incomes would have been volatile as well, rising and falling from year to year. And volatile incomes are costly to people. A basic economic observation that people don't like income risk. They seek to avoid it. They'd rather have a smooth middling value of income than to have high income one year followed by relatively low income the following year. We think that, we economists think that's true of all people. It's fundamental to risk preferences of people around the world. We think that it's especially true, Bodway and I think it's especially true in this case, if we take into account the evidence we have that the Anishinaabe lived a way of life that was very near to subsistence, particularly in the 19th century. They were poor. And people closer to poverty or to subsistence income levels would bear even more costs from volatile rising and falling incomes for reasons that I think are fairly clear.
Let me just catch up, please. And will you soon get to why you call this the Vidal Anderson report? I have read it, but it's was something I struggled with understanding.
So Your Honor,
you may have it,
It's coming.
in your order coming up, but I'll just signal to you that it's
so my answer to the question that you just framed, Your Honor, is on slide 123, and we're currently on 116. It's at your discretion. I'll talk about it.
I'm okay if you stick with your order.
Right then, so let's continue with 117 if you have no more on 116, Professor.
Well, I guess I was going to say on 116, if I may, but briefly, that I just talked about the risk in NCRs. I want to point out the Vidal Anderson approach deals with that risk by smoothing payments over time, not by lowering them or raising them persistently over time, just smoothing that annual variation. And
So your approach,
yes,
okay, smooths it.
and if it will clarify things for Your Honor, I'll try to say our approach instead of the Vidal Anderson approach. This is our approach, and you'll understand soon why we
Okay.
use that name.
Okay,
And we think the treaty parties perceive that risk and that they sought to avoid such risks as well. That's the last thing I wanted to say based on slide 116.
And it appears you will address the underpinnings for that comment fairly soon as well.
Yes, I think so.
So then let's move to slide 117 then and continue with the explanation of your approach.
Still talking about economic principles, soon to talk about historical background. What we're saying is that our approach to augmentation is better for annuitants than the joint venture approach would have been. First point that I've made is that the first point on this slide is the one I've just made, and that is that it reduces risk to which the annuitants are exposed in their annual incomes. The second point is, and this again, it may be self-evident or not, we're proposing that the Crown would have paid out interest on the capital sum instead of paying out the capital sum as it accrued from year to year. And I wish to make it clear that receiving the interest on a sum over time is just as good as receiving the original, the fundamental capital sum itself. There's no loss associated with receiving this stream of interest indefinitely over time relative to instead receiving that sum upfront. That's a basic principle of financial economics, but it may not be obvious to everyone on first glance that the interest over time is just as good, has the same economic value as the capital sum. The third and last point that we think supports our approach to annuities is that it deals with the problem of NCR losses. As I've been at pains to say for 2.5 days, our estimate is that the Crown earned losses on its treaty NCR account in many years, and those losses accumulated over the last 60 years to a large negative cumulative sum by 2019. The approach that we're proposing to augmented annuities deals with those losses in a way which is consistent with economic principles, as well as the historical ones that I'll discuss, and is better for the annuitants than the joint venture model here would be. And the reason is that in our approach, the annuitants are never called on to cover any share of those losses. They don't have to contribute anything to help the Crown deal with the losses that we've estimated the Crown is experiencing in NCRs.
Which you say flows from a joint venture approach.
We say that it flows from the approach proposed by Stiglitz and Hutchings to valuing the augmentation promise from NCRs. And they call that approach the joint venture approach.
Thank you.
On slide 118, Professor, you begin to address the calculation mechanism. Can you take us through that process, please?
Yes. And I'll just quickly say, again, I'm calling on the patience of everyone here. I want to explain exactly what we're proposing before getting into the historical background and the name. So how do we calculate this? It's not too complicated. I've written it here on the slide. In my opinion, it's straightforward what we're doing here. And there are 4 conceptual steps in the calculation. So again, everything here is contingent on the NCRs. Right? We've estimated NCRs. We can imagine at some point in the past, the Crown estimated the treaty NCRs in a year. And in that year and in every year, the Crown then would take some share of those NCRs to be discussed and add it to this capital account that I outlined 2 minutes ago.
And when you say added, that's not in dollars, it's in accounting.
I think that's a fair statement. This is all, we're just imagining a piece of paper inside a Crown Treasury official's office at this point.
Okay.
Now, when I do calculations, both an illustrative calculation on the next slide and then going forward, I'm going to assume that 100% of the annual NCRs get assigned to that account. And I'll talk about sharing afterwards. And all the same principles will apply, it's just they will apply to a different share of the NCRs year by year. So it will simplify matters if we just think about the NCRs are devoted to this account for now.
Okay.
So what happens in this accounting exercise, step 2, if NCRs are positive in some year, that positive amount for the year is added to the capital. And so the capital balance in the account goes up. If the NCRs are negative for that year, then that amount is subtracted from the capital balance in the account. Now, so we have a capital balance in the account, which is just the cumulative sum of the NCRs so far. If the cumulative sum is positive, then there's some capital, sort of positive capital in the account, and interest is paid out on that on an annual basis at the band trust account rate that prevailed in that year, given the policies of the Federal Department of Indian Affairs. So those are all the steps in the calculation. Item 4 is just a note here. We're talking about the payment of interest on that accumulated capital sum. If at any point the arrangement were terminated and there were positive capital account, our interpretation of what we're doing is that positive capital in the account, there would be a payment of that amount to the Anishinaabe annuitants. And so they would have a right to receive the amount from the CRF that the government has been recording in its annuity account up to that point. But in the normal operation of this fund, you just pay out the interest year after year after year.
You pay out 100% of the interest?
Yes, 100% of the interest as I've defined it here every year. And
So then at the end of year 2, there's no more interest on.
No, Your Honor. So we don't pay out the principal amounts. We only
No.
pay out interest on those principal amounts. The very next slide will show you
Okay.
in an example mechanically how we do this. But we talked, I think, on day one about, no, two, on 5% as a reasonable interest rate to bear in mind. The same would apply here, because that often was the BTA rate.
Mhm.
So if, for example, there was $1 million of capital in the account at that point, we would not pay $1 million to the annuitants. We pay 5% of $1 million to the annuitants this year, and we pay 5% of the $1 million to the annuitants next year if there've been no changes in the capital,
Okay,
and so on forever. Okay, so we might, Mr. Marcelo, when you're ready, we'll look at the example.
Your Honor.
yes,
All right, let's go to slide 119 then and have a walkthrough of that, please.
So this is a simplified example. The numbers are obviously made up, and we'll assume this just operates over 10 years. And I'll talk about what happens at the end of that 10 years. The amounts of NCRs year by year, again, are simply made up numbers that's given in column 2 of this table for each year. But the pattern of those amounts, while they're very small, if you interpret these as dollars, pattern is roughly what we believe NCRs were according to our estimates. So there are some negative years early on, then some positive years. It goes up and down between positives and negatives. And eventually, in this example, by year 7, it settles down to minus 500 NCRs year by year. So for the last 4 years in the example, the Crown is earning losses on its treaty NCR account of 500. So that column 2, labeled NCRs to be shared, is the starting point. It comes out of everything that we have discussed so far here in the court and the notional, the hypothetical accounting exercise the Crown did over NCRs. The next 2 columns show how our approach to the annuity account, which we call the Vidal-Anderson approach,
Mhm.
operates. So column 3 is the capital in the account, and that's just the cumulative sum of that flow of NCRs, of those annual NCR amounts, added up year by year. So in the first year of operation of this fund, NCRs were minus 100.
Mhm.
And so the capital amount is minus 100, goes from 0, the beginning of the first year, to minus 100 at the end. The next year, it's minus 100 NCRs again. Again, that minus 100 is added to the capital account. So now the capital account has a balance of minus 200 at the end of year 2. Third year gets more interesting. Now NCRs are positive 500, accruing to the Crown during that year. Again, they add that amount to the capital account. And so it rises from minus 200 at the beginning of the year to positive 300 by the end of the year. So we wiped out all of the accumulated losses, and we have $300 left over in NCRs, which are counted as positive capital in the account. And it just goes on like that. Each year, we add the NCRs that accrued in that year to the cumulative sum so far to get the new capital balance. And so, again, in this simple example, in year 7, the losses start to pile up. And by assumption, there are no further positive NCRs. So let's think about what happens to the capital in the account. Start of that year 7, there's $1,300 in the account. 500 loss in the current year reduces capital from 1,300 to 800. Next year, same thing. Capital goes from 800 to 300. Next year, the same. Capital goes from 300 to minus 200, and so on. Right. So year by year, the capital that has been accumulated so far from the positive years, now at the end, that capital starts to dwindle as these losses, late year losses, add up. So overall, column 3 shows you the capital that's in the account each year, and it's just the sum of the NCRs that have accrued for all years from the beginning until today. But that's all accounting. That's just government accounting. Has nothing to do with the annuitants yet. The 4th column shows you how we believe the annuity, the augmented annuity amounts would have been calculated and paid out to the Anishinaabe.
Mhm.
So to do this step, I'm going to assume that the interest rate is always 5%.
That would be your assumption of the band trust account rate?
Yes, particularly in this example with all made up data, everything here is for simplicity. So I'll assume that the rate is always 5%. In practice, when we do these calculations, we use the actual band trust account rate, which in some years was 5%, other years was, of course, not.
Thank you.
So 5% of what is the question? Our answer is the Crown would have paid out as an annuity 5% of the capital in the account, an interest amount equal to 5% of the capital in the account, if the capital was positive, but only if the capital is positive. In years where the capital was negative, instead of paying negative interest, which in the standard economic and accounting interpretation, a payment of a negative amount would mean receipt of that amount from the other party in the transaction. But we don't think the Crown would have paid negative interest. In other words, we don't think the Crown would have demanded an equivalent payment from the annuitants of those amounts in the years of negative capital. We think they would have instead paid the minimum specified in the treaty of $2,000 as a fixed lump sum for all the annuitants collectively. Again, for simplicity here, I'll assume that the minimum is $0. But in practice, when you do the calculation, we recognize that the treaty specifies a $2,000 fixed annuity and discusses augmentations relative to that. So the amounts in this example that are paid as annuities, first 2 years are 0, the minimum. But in year 3, there's 300 in the account. 5% of 300 is 15. And so that's the augmented annuity that would have been paid in that year. The following year, there's 1,300 in the account. 5% of that is 65. That's the amount that would have been paid, and so on, year by year, always 5% of the accumulated capital until year 9. So now by year 9, the losses have piled up enough. The capital is back to a negative number in the account. Again, we don't think the annuitants would have been called on for anything in that case. They would have got the minimum specified in the treaty, which here for simplicity is taken to be 0. So on the prior slide, I said getting the interest is as good as getting the capital. We demonstrate that to you in the example. We simply add up all of the payments here for the various years under the annuity model that we're proposing, that I just described to you. And then we add interest on that in the usual present value way, the same way that we talked about this morning. And the cumulative present value of all of those annuity payments in this example is $301. That's the sum of all the amounts in the 4th annuity column, plus the interest on those amounts up to year 10. So that's the present value of the annuities under this model in this example. We can contrast our model, illustrated through those calculations, with the joint venture model. Joint venture model says, just pay out the NCRs and call that the annuity in this case, because we're assuming 100% sharing. And so under the joint venture model in column 5, we've illustrated the payments that would be received by the annuitants, hypothetically, with augmentation. And because in the example, and because in our own estimates of the reality, there are years with negative NCRs, there would be negative annuity payments. Negative annuity payment would mean a contribution of capital from the annuitants to the Crown. So if we add up, so that means in each year the annuity is just the NCRs under the joint venture model. If we add up the present value of that stream of payments in our example, we arrive at a figure of minus 445. So the present, just as in our estimates for the RST, in reality, the cumulative present value of NCRs is a negative number, here minus 445. If NCRs are annuities, then the present value of annuities under that model is also minus 445. So the difference between them, right, 301 in this case under our model, and minus 445 under the joint venture model, is in this example the evidence that the joint venture model is worse for the annuitants in the presence of losses. The difference between those two amounts is $745 roughly, which is the $700 loss in the capital account by the end, plus the interest on the first 2 years of losses as well. So I know this is a lot.
I have only one question if you're done with that slide, and if you're not, then please continue.
I just want to say that the reason I thought it was good, would possibly be helpful to go through every excruciating step of these example calculations is that it backs up the third point on the prior slide, because the third point deals with the NCR losses in an economically appropriate way, whereas the joint venture model does not. What do I mean by that? I mean, the annuitants are not called on for losses in our model.
And then before we go to slide 120, where you have the term present value of sum 301, what interest rate do you use to get that 301?
Sorry, are you on
I'm still on
119?
119, just at the bottom.
Oh, I
The
see.
professors told us the 5% figure was an assumed value for the band trust account rates, if I recall his testimony. I'm asking him, the present value sum 301, was there an interest rate used to get that? And if so, what was it?
Yes, in this purely illustrative example, I also assume the interest rate on government bonds is 5%. When we compute present values, we always use the government bond rate to do so. Here I've assumed it's always 5% and added 5% compound interest to the annuity amounts to compute the sum. In reality, the BTA rate, the band trust account rate, was not always the same as the Government of Canada bond rate. Many years it was higher. So in practice, if in the example I had that difference, that would be a further reason why our approach, the Vidal-Anderson approach, is better for the annuitants, because they're receiving their payouts of interest on the account at the BTA rate. To the extent it's higher than the government bond rate, that's a premium return on the capital that's held in that account to generate the annuities.
We come now to slide 120, Professor, and a point Your Honor mentioned some, I'm going to say 15 minutes ago. You now begin to engage with that point. Why don't you explain what you want to say about that here, please?
So we think that this approach is consistent with the historical evidence as we understand it, while the joint venture model is inconsistent with the relevant historical evidence about payments to First Nation members, and in particular payments of annuities to the Anishinaabe. There are 4 ways in which I think that's true, consistent with historical evidence. The first is this kind of model I've just described is how the Crown at that time handled all similar payments to First Nations. Each one of the points here gets at least one slide to follow. The second point is that we believe that what I just described to you is exactly what was proposed in the Vidal-Anderson Commission report of 1849. The next point about that, this court has already said that Robinson relied on that commission report during treaty negotiations. The third historical point is that what we are proposing is consistent with the evidence that we have on what Anishinaabe treaty signatories thought augmentation meant in terms of the mechanics of payments. And the final point is we think that what I just described is consistent with the accounting that the Crown engaged in around the augmentation to $4 per capita in 1874-75. Now, that augmentation was different because it was limited to $4, whereas what we're describing is not limited to $4 per capita, obviously. But I believe we can draw parallels between the accounting exercise that was done prior to the augmentation to $4 and the accounting exercise I just described.
Well, on slide 121, then you developed the first of your 4 points, called, and I quote, "It is how the Crown then handled payments to First Nations," end quote. Can you develop that for us now, please?
I'd like to preface this by note that here I'm relying on what I read in a report by Professor von Gernot and in his demonstrators as well, in addition to my own expertise in understanding public finance principles in the 19th century. I'm going to meld the two here. What Professor von Gernot wrote and said relates to how the Crown handled proceeds of land sales or land cessions, where the amounts, the proceeds were due to First Nations people. He wrote that it was exceedingly rare, I think those are my words, not his, but it was rare after the year 1818 for the Crown to pay out those proceeds from, say, a land sale as a one-time lump sum. Instead, as Professor von Gernot described, the proceeds were held by the Crown in what was then called land accounts. And the interest on the cumulative sum in those land accounts was paid out annually to the First Nations people or on some other periodic basis. So would you like me to continue, Mr. Marcel?
If your honors,
Yes, thank you.
fine.
So what I'm describing here, proceeds of a land sale is treated differently. And the interest on those proceeds is treated differently. That actually conformed to a more general principle that we see in the public accounts of the 19th century in Canada. And the idea here was that the land was a capital asset. And so the revenue generated by disposing of that capital asset was also capital. It was cash, it was money, but it was capital. It should be treated differently, and it should be distinguished in the government's accounts from ordinary revenue, the term then for what today we call operating revenue, which is recurrent revenue from a source that we get year after year. So a one-time sale of an asset like land would generate a cash capital asset. And that would not be included in the operating revenue or ordinary revenue for that year. Instead, it would be set aside by the Crown to create benefits for future years and future generations of people in the province or in Canada. That was the principle that I'm describing. The Crown didn't always behave that way with its own assets. Sometimes they would sell a capital asset and it was mad money and they would spend it that year. But it was often treated in the way I've just described. And if proceeds of a sale were not treated that way, questions were raised about why not. I want to acknowledge that it's not just a 19th century principle. I think it's also a reflection of the paternalistic relationship that the Crown then had in dealing with First Nations people. So it was a principle that they tried to apply to themselves, but behaving paternalistically, I believe they were even more likely to use that principle in dealing with First Nations and not allow them to avail themselves of the capital method.
Thank you. you continue your development of this point on the next slide, slide 122.
Well, the passages I just cited, Professor von Gerner was talking about a period before the treaty. When we want to look at the period after the treaty where hypothetically augmentation would have been paid, I'd like to offer some observations on historical practice in that period as well, in the later period as well. And so here I rely on the expert report submitted by Dr. Eric Angel here, which I've read. And he talks about these same land accounts after 1850, and particularly the ones that were created for RST First Nations. In his report, he calls them not land accounts, but principal sub-accounts, which I understand was the name then applied by the Crown, but it's the same thing. Dr. Angel also notes that the Crown paid out interest, but not principal, typically from those principal sub-accounts. I have excerpted 3 very short quotes from the Angel report to support that, Mr. Marcello. I can either read them out loud or not, as you prefer.
Your Honor?
Go ahead. If you
Why
want on the
don't- why
record,
don't
go
you
ahead.
please?
If you want on the record.
Why don't you please?
So Dr. Angel wrote, the prompt for the creation of these band-specific accounts was some kind of land or timber sale that generated substantial revenue. Again, they were proceeds from a resource sale. Second, he wrote, the government paid 5% interest on the cash balances in the principal sub-account. Here, Dr. Angel is referencing the BTA rate that applied during the 1860s, 5%. Third, he wrote, expenditures out of principal sub-accounts were infrequent and generally limited, though occasionally there were major capital projects paid for out of the principal sub-accounts. This third point, it's important to support what I've said because it means generally the capital from the proceeds of the resource sale were not available to the First Nations people. The only cases in which they were available correspond to this 19th century principle of public finance. It could, in some cases, be used to finance acquisition of an asset, which would generate benefits over time, such as building a school or a hospital.
When you say this 19th century principle of public finance, do you say that, I know you mentioned this just moments ago, but do you say that is a principle of public finance that the Crown was following, articulated, bound by?
The Crown did articulate this idea again and again in public finance documents in the 19th century. For example, in budget speeches, both of the Ontario Treasurer and of the Federal Minister of Finance, this question of certain expenditures and certain revenues, whether they should be treated as capital or as ordinary sums, recurring sums, came up again and again. It's also still a principle of public finance to this day. I might add, we make these distinctions in the public accounts today. And typically when the government disposes of an asset, the proceeds from that disposition aren't treated as operating revenue. They don't serve to change the resources available in the current budget. They don't change revenues or the deficit today. Instead, they affect other accounting concepts, such as the net debt of the government, a capital account concept, or the accumulated deficit of the government.
Did that happen when they sold the LCBO?
I'm not aware of that particular sale, but it would typically happen in those cases if there was, an entity that was part of the Consolidated Revenue Fund. Then when it was sold or alienated, or just set up as an arm's length agency of any kind, it would be treated as a capital sum. It would not be treated as operating revenue. And therefore, a government that's thinking about its deficit would not say, I have this money now and I can spend it. It would be really only on the capital account and not on the operating account.
If they're thinking of their accumulated deficit, you said it could affect their net debt or accumulated deficit.
Yes,
They could
capital
use like
account
that.
concepts only.
Okay,
Thank you, Professor. Now, as we are, I suppose it's fair to say, all a little bit tired, I just remind that you are addressing points that you, as I understood you say, support your view, your annuities model view. And we move now to the second of those points on the next slide, 123. Do we?
Yes, please. Right, so the second point about the consistency of our approach with historical evidence. Second point is the one Your Honor asked for before. We think it's consistent with what was discussed in the Vidal Anderson report. So I'll remind everyone of these issues and explain my understanding of the evidence the court's already heard on this. So what we know is that the seed for the augmentation clause of the treaties itself was in passages of the Vidal Anderson report. In the 1849 report, Vidal and Anderson wrote the following. And again, here, I'll read a short quote if I may. From the report, quote, provision might be made if necessary for further payment to the Anishinaabe treaty parties upon discovery and development of any new sources of wealth. So that's the seed, as I understand it, for the augmentation clause. The idea was, Vidal and Anderson were saying, well, a payment has to be made to the Anishinaabe. It's difficult to ascertain the value of this territory. We don't know how much will be generated in NCRs in the future. And so it may be necessary to make provision to pay some amounts upfront, but other amounts in the future. And that is the augmentation. That's the seed of the augmentation clause. That's my understanding. Now, the important part for us is what did they say next in that report of 1849? They said, if payments are not going to be made upfront at the time of signing the treaty, quote, the only alternative would appear to be investment of the proceeds of sales in the funds, I'll come back to that, and the application of the annual interest of the sum to the general benefit of all of the Indians occupying it. I want to note that the term the funds that appears in the middle of the sentence meant in the 19th century the purchase of government bonds. So what that passage says is if the amounts are not going to be paid fully up front and some are going to be contingent payments later, contingent on NCRs collected, the only way to do that would be to invest the proceeds from the lands, that is the NCRs, invest the NCRs in government bonds, and then pay out, apply in their language, apply the annual interest on that sum, those purchases of government bonds for the benefit of the annuitants. Well, that's what we propose doing.
by chance, as we go through this section, Mr. Marcello, do you have this part of the Vidal Anderson report? You can put-
It is, I was actually gonna bring that up. It's in the transcribed, there's two versions of it. The one everybody probably wants to try to read is the transcribed version, which is in the JBD at tab 6395 in the JBD, and you're likely looking at paragraphs 10 and 11, if my notes are correct in that
And
regard.
does someone have that
I don't have
as a
it
slide?
here.
Can someone generate that?
It's footnoted in reports. Did you want us to hold? You want to take a break now?
Well, I'm just, I don't know how long this would take. Someone will tell me.
Want us to email it to you?
We have JBD here, I think. It's long. The GPT.
Yeah. I'm using the exact one. That's why I prefer to write Professor Crowley's.
I've just got a different legible copy. I'm right up. Speed it up.
I was like to work at a fast food joint. I was dead.
I missed it.
He said, I think we need more
Respect.
spectrum. Very good. Okay.
I just want to see the joint book of documents in operation.
You are.
Here it comes.
So I will stop, and
What-
I
what-
assume you have questions about this?
I
Your
just,
Honor?
I just wanted to see it. You said paragraphs 10 and 11.
That's what I thought, that's what I had noted,
Okay, let's go there.
but I'm not obviously giving the evidence. Maybe it's pages. I don't know.
Maybe pages 10
more
and
likely.
11.
Try the pages number.
Okay, I found it. It's on page 5 of 16, in the middle of the page, beginning of the paragraph. It will.
If that's what you're looking for.
Page 5 of 16. That has the quote, provision might be made if necessary.
We're just checking it against the report now.
What is this, the letter?
Well, I think this is footnoted in in their report, and we're just checking.
Oh, in the
In the,
Bodway and Smart report?
yes.
So it's still on page 5?
Are you looking for the second quote? Because it's also on page 5. Should it be deemed inexpedient paragraph for the second? Oh, okay.
Here we go. Control L. There we go. Right, this is good. I can read this. Okay, got it.
Should I continue?
I have it now and the witness will have it as well. Go ahead with your
Yeah,
questions.
I don't have any questions about this transcription. So if we move on to the next slide, you continue your discussion of the Dell Anderson report.
Yeah, yes. Before moving on, I'll just note for the record, that's not the transcription I relied on. It was different in some inconsequential ways from the transcription I relied on, which explains the differences that may have been noted
Maybe
between
we should
the
check this out.
quotation on my slide and the quotation that was just displayed based on Mr. Schachter's version.
Yeah, let's see,
There-
let us see at the break. We'll try and cite it back through the report.
And if you
Uh,
can,
yeah.
whatever you're relying on, if you can bring it before the court, even on a piece of paper. Do you have we have a printer available through the registrar if you need it.
Okay, in any event, so on 124, you continue on and you begin by referencing the stage 1 reasons for judgment.
Right. So I'll just ask once more for control L, if I may. This helps me focus, I think, on the words and on the thoughts that will soon be presented to you. And so we're still on this point that it was proposed in the Vidal Anderson report. We saw the quote. I'll add, at the risk of boring your honor, here's what you wrote about it. I will not read, if I may. Well, you guide me, Mr. Marcelo. Shall I read this out loud?
Please.
Go ahead.
So from the stage 1 reasons for judgment, quote, the commissioners made a novel proposal based on their extensive consultations with the Anishinaabe. The significance of this recommendation cannot be minimized. So Baudouin and I read that, and we went and read the report and found the passage that discussed the method of annuitization that I just quoted to you. I
And-
also,
Sorry.
Yes.
Your understanding of the quote from the trial decision is that it was referencing. Say that again, the way
Yes.
that,
so the passage quoted here, I believe, is a reference to the Vidal Anderson report and the role that it played in the framing of the augmentation clause at the time of the treaty. I do not present myself as an expert on the history of the treaty, as you understand,
okay,
but I interpret that passage as meaning what Vidal and Anderson had to say was pertinent. And we have picked up on the quoted clause in which Vidal and Anderson describe the way in which NCRs could be converted into further payments to the Anishinaabe in later years.
thank you. Do you have a paragraph report, paragraph reference from the trial decision? Oh, on that page, no.
I'm sure that in our report that's cited in the footline at paragraphs 94 and 95, we will have a precise citation to the stage 1 reasons.
Thank you.
It's possibly 174, 175, and 180, but we'll check that. Those are the 3 paragraphs cited, Your Honor, 174, 175, and 180.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
So I also think, and I think here I'm also guided by the stage 1 reasons, that Robinson would, well, I'm not sure about that, but this is my opinion. I think that Robinson would also have had in mind his instructions from the Executive Council that sent him to negotiate the treaty. In his instructions, he was told by Executive Council that amounts paid out, quote, would be considered as a deduction from the capital sum of which the annuities would be the interest. Here I've highlighted that clause, capital sum of which the annuities would be the interest. This clause does not reference augmentation of annuities, which was not contemplated in the instructions, as we all know. But in my opinion, it does clearly state that annuities are to be calculated as an amount of interest on a capital sum, rather than the annuities being that capital sum itself. Of course, the instructions told Robinson how much capital he should be thinking about to finance, to purchase the treaty, if you like. But this clause says the amounts that would be paid out, the annuities, would be the interest on that capital sum.
But in these instructions, executive council is talking about, I don't want to use the word funds because now I know it has a different meaning.
Yes,
The executive council is talking about money that is theirs and how they wish to manage their money,
I agree, Your Honor.
which is not, and as you say, at the time, they had no contemplation of augmentations. But you say this supports what people were thinking at the time of augmentation discussions?
I think it supports the idea that in the minds of Crown officials in the 19th century, annuities were recurrent payments that could be financed with interest on a certain sum invested in government bonds. And I would also perhaps qualify my previous answer just a little. The capital sums that were talked about in the instructions were amounts in the possession of the Crown, but they may not have all been the property of the Crown.
And there's a last point there concerning practices you mentioned a few minutes ago. And I wonder then, Your Honor, would it be an appropriate time after the professor addresses that point to take the afternoon break?
I think so. Thank you.
Thank you. Ed, please.
Yeah, so the last bullet simply notes that, in my opinion, Robinson would have been aware of the practices of the Indian Department, as it was then called, which we noted on the prior 2 to 3 slides, of not paying out proceeds as capital, but rather paying out interest on capital. He, in my opinion, would have been aware of that because he had served for several years as a financial official in the government of the province of Canada.
Thank you, Professor. We'll stand down in a moment pursuant to Her Honor's direction.
15 minutes.
Let's put recess for 15 minutes.
Well, I like to do that.
We're all right.
Number, so you may be seated.
So,
So here we are.
there is the odd onion in the JBD Petunia patch. And I want to clarify something. Mr. Schachter produced a document. It's not the Schachter document. It is the right one from the JBD. It's the one that has the number that I provided. So that's what's in the JBD, but the witnesses said, Professor Smart said that's not the one he used. I think he said that. He used a different document or a different version of the document. So I wonder if the solution here might just be to ask Professor Smart if he's able to find the one that he used.
Go ahead.
I think I can, and will if you wish.
Okay, so do our best.
I
to
understand
sort.
you'll be back, so.
It's probably not gonna make it. Yeah, and on that point, the area to come after this is a little thick and probably is not best to cut in half or cut into pieces. I wonder if we can finish this section of the professor's testimony, pick it up on Tuesday. I'm pretty sure I'll be finished by midday.
And was that your estimate?
It's
A
better
Monday
than-
finish?
Better than our estimate.
Okay,
So then we're not grappling with complicated stuff and have to break it up.
so you well budgeted for my interruptions? I
Okay,
appreciate it.
so
If I might, when my friend says that he'll be finished by lunch on Tuesday,
I'm guessing that.
is that the direct evidence of the witness or just your portion of the direct evidence?
There is no other portion.
Oh, okay.
I'm not sure what he was hoping for. Okay,
Okay,
so let's do that.
are we keeping the light on then? Is it? All right, Professor, you come now to slide 125 and you address the understanding of the Anishinaabe signatories in regard to your proposed annuity model. So let's talk about that, please.
I'll just pause until we see 125. If you please. So we think that this approach, the Vidal-Anderson approach, as we've called it, is consistent with the understanding of Anishinaabe signatories to the extent that we have documentary evidence on that. The evidence, there was broader evidence of what the Anishinaabe thought about the augmentation clause, but on the specific question of the mechanics of how to go about it, this is the only evidence that I'm aware of. I encountered it as I was reviewing public finance documents from this period. Speech that was appended to a report that was submitted. I was reading as part of my review of the Crown's policies with respect to the treaty territories, their fiscal policies. And when I saw it, I thought, what a wonderful opportunity for us to hear from an Anishinaabe treaty signatory of what he thought should happen. The individual in question is Chief Bukudjanene. In his speech at Garden River in 1864, he said the following: Mr. Robinson promised us that the land should be surveyed and sold. He was speaking about the treaties. And that at the end of 1 year, we and each member of our people should receive $4 in cash. And the next clause is the relevant one. And that the rest of the money should be invested at interest for our benefit. So as an economist, when I read that, I believe he's talking about the model of augmentation that I've described, that we are proposing and calculating. In other words, he believed that augmentation meant payment of a stream of interest on the money, that is the NCRs, and that the Anishinaabe annuitants would receive that stream of interest over a sequence of years, not as an upfront payment of the NCRs themselves. I'll note that Bukudjanene, I'm not sure if his name has come up in these proceedings before, but he was the son of Chief Shingwakants, whose name certainly did come up. He was later chief of the Garden River First Nation himself, and he was a signatory of the RHT in 1850. The 1864 report that presents the transcription of his speech also notes that present on that day was Chief Nebene Goching, whose name I believe also has come up in these proceedings.
And do you say that the son of Chief Shingacombs was a signatory?
Yes, he was, Your Honor. His name is recorded on the transcription of the treaty that I've seen, and I've seen several. It's the English transliteration is different than the one that I understand is used, the one that I put on this slide, which I think is the modern one. It was something, I can say it, but at risk of the court reporter having trouble, the way it was transliterated on the treaty.
Thank you. Now on slide 126, you go to your fourth point in this area, the 1875 augmentation.
Well, just very briefly, as an economist, the court has heard a great deal of evidence about augmentation in 1875, as I understand it. As an economist, in looking at that, what's being described there for the 1875 augmentation process and the arbitrations around it is really the same as we're talking about. My summary is in the two sub-bullets here. As I see it, what happened that triggered augmentation in 1875 was that officials prepared accounts in which they summed up NCRs for the RST territory. And that augmentation, that is the augmentation of annuities to $4, was triggered by, and it required in the minds of those people, the determination that given those accumulated NCRs up to any given year, that the interest on those accumulated NCRs would be sufficient to finance a $4 annuity. So the parallel that I'm suggesting here is in 1875, the augmentation was not based on all of the NCRs generated, nor was it conceived that it would be done in that way in the future. It was an augmentation to $4, but only to $4 when the interest on accumulated capital would be sufficient to finance it. And that's what we're proposing without imposing the $4 cap. We're saying the augmentation that is affordable, that the Crown can pay without incurring loss, is the augmentation equal to the interest on the accumulated capital sum. So it's a parallel that we see there.
I'm just trying to follow it here. When you say you're suggesting that in 1875, the augmentation is not based on all of the NCCRs generated, i.e. all of the actual NCCRs, nor was it conceived to do so. But it was, you come up with, you say it was an augmentation of $4 because that was at least, there was capital to finance $4 worth of interest.
Yes, and I can perhaps be more precise. As I understand the process,
In 1875?
In 1875 and
Okay.
continued, right? So indeed, that specific process took place in the early 1870s to trigger the augmentation. Same questions continued to be asked throughout the arbitration process. And they were not asking, okay, here, that's a quotation, I'm putting myself in the minds of these officials. They weren't saying, okay, in this given year, be it 1873, 1874, whatever, is there enough NCRs to pay $4 this year? Instead, they were saying, how much have we accumulated in NCRs so far? And is that amount sufficient to finance a $4 annuity in perpetuity? As Your Honor will know, there was a great deal of debate about what the capitalized sum associated with the augmentation should be.
You say that's the question they ask themselves in the arbitration. Is the current amount in the capital account enough to finance $4 annual payment in perpetuity?
Yes. I say it is if we include in the arbitration the original question of whether annuities to the Anishinaabe should be augmented, which of course was a discussion that took place among officials of the various governments.
Right. So you say there were two questions. Should they be augmented? If A, then B, and B is then the question, is there enough to finance a $4 annual payment in perpetuity?
Yes, that's what I believe.
And have we ever seen this question articulated in the arbitrations or in the?
So that's a good question. And I'm not sure what evidence the court has seen on this. There is some discussion in the footnotes to our present value report, Exhibit 61, that deal with this. And I'm referring here in particular to the $205,000 capitalized amount, which officials associated with the augmentation, or I think in that case, the RHT. In all of these cases, they were capitalizing the annuities, which means to use an interest rate to determine what amount of capital is equivalent at a given interest rate to a stream of payments.
And you
into
say
the
that was a
future.
conversation when they talked about capitalizing the annuity amount. That was a conversation looking back at what they had in their accounts? Or was it a conversation about looking forward, what they had to do now to finance payments that perhaps they hadn't been paying attention to for the last 25 years?
It is
Or
the
50
latter.
years.
In other words, but the two are related. In other words, they said, if we pay $4 per capita in perpetuity, given particular assumptions about what the population, what the capita part would be,
Right?
how much will that cost us in future? Well, it will cost us certain amounts year by year forever. What is the equivalent capital sum today? The answer to that question depends on the interest rate assumed. So we can talk about annuitizing a capital sum, that is using an interest rate to turn a capital sum into a flow of payments. That's what Bodway and I are talking about.
Mhm.
But equivalently, we can go in the other direction and say, how can we capitalize a flow of payments at a given interest rate? There's always an equivalence between a stream of payments
Mhm.
and a one-time capital sum. That equivalence depends on what interest rate is paid on assets at any given time. So there's a parallel here. We're saying compute the stream of payments as by multiplying interest times a capital sum.
I know how it happens, but my question was, have we ever seen this question articulated through the arbitration process?
Yes, so
say-
my answer to that is, it's the same question in reverse that was discussed throughout the arbitration process.
You say that theme was addressed in a looking forward.
They were saying, if we will now pay this stream of $4 payments in perpetuity, then what capital amount needs to have been generated from NCRs so far to finance it?
Okay. And then you said, I thought they were looking forward, but that's the way they generally thought of paying recurring obligations from a capital sum. Or
Yes,
did I miss that?
yes.
And you will hear more on that in days to come.
Okay. I think I've got it.
In the footline of this slide on that question you've asked, I've referenced Appendix B of our present value report, Exhibit 61, in which we give the history of the annuities and the augmentations.
And now, Professor, we turn to, or return, I guess, really to the concept of calculation of annuities under your model. And you repeat some of the points you raised earlier, but you develop them further. So why don't we go through that? 127.
Yes, so up to this point, we've been talking about the Vidal-Anderson approach in conceptual terms and illustrating it through toy examples of numbers. But this is in fact what we do in order to compute annuities for our actual estimates of NCRs. So before presenting the results of those calculations, I just want to remind everyone of what we're doing in these calculations. We're proceeding in exactly the way described above and illustrated through the toy example. Again, I propose not to read all the words again here, except for where they differ from before. So item 1 and 2 on slide 127, exactly the same as we discussed before. Now on item 3, the annuities that are augmented annuities that are paid out each year are the interest on the capital sum. But the interest is computed at the BTA rate. That is to say, the amount equals the BTA interest rate of that year times the capital amount in the account to date. That amount is paid out if it is more than the $2,000 base annuity. Otherwise, the $2,000 base annuity is paid out.
Okay.
So item 3 says how we calculate the annuities that hypothetically would have been paid in each year. Item 4 probably corresponds to item 4 on or 3 on the previous slide. It just says present value up to 2019 or 2020 is calculated by adding compound interest at the Government of Canada long-term bond rate, just as we do all the time when we do present values. So the distinction between the interest rates specified in items 3 and 4 is fully discussed in our present value report and Appendix B of it. We think that the payment that was triggered out of the capital account that was being maintained by the Crown officials, those payments would be made at the BTA interest rate, as was the practice of the Department of Indian Affairs. But that determines the nominal amount that would have been paid out in augmented annuities year by year. When it comes to converting that into a present value today or in 2020, we're then using the Government of Canada long-term bond rate, which is our estimate of the time value of money. Sometimes those two rates are the same, and the distinction I'm making is not important, but in other cases, the BTA rate is higher, and proceeding in this way, including the BTA rate at step 3, raises the value of annuities. The last item here, again, deals with losses. When we do this computation, as we've already explained, we estimate that NCRs accumulate to a negative value because of the losses over the last 60 or so years. And that means that in this hypothetical Vidal Anderson account, there will be a negative capital balance in 2019 when our computations terminate, but we do not charge that amount to the annuities or to the annuitants themselves. There is no capital contribution from the annuitants to cover those losses. So we have a notional capital account. In 2019, it says the Crown lost on its NCRs, but the Crown bears those losses.
Crown only bears the losses if they're paying out $2,000 when there is nothing in the there's nothing in the capital account the capital account generates less than $2,000.
Well, in saying the Crown bears losses, I'm simply saying NCRs are negative and that they sum to a negative amount over time. So I can make that
But
statement.
there's no loss to the Crown if it's not a joint venture at that point.
Well, the Crown lost money on NCRs in the RST in our estimation. So, I mean, that statement can be made, in my opinion, without reference to the treaty itself. The first question we ask is, what were NCRs? Our answer is NCRs were negative. It was a loss in that sense. So in saying the Crown bore losses, I'm simply saying NCRs were negative.
But the flat rate would still be paid.
The next question is, what implication does that have for annuities? And here our answer is, well, the annuities could never be lower than $2,000 paid to the annuitants.
Which is pretty close to nothing.
Is that a question, Your Honor?
Well, I mean, $2,000 is it's not a present, it's a sum from 1850, a population.
Yes, it's a
So,
nominal amount.
I thought I was just parroting back what I've heard last few days.
So yes, Your Honor, I totally agree. I mean, my personal opinion is $2,000 is not a lot of money in the context that we're talking about it here. In my toy example, I turned that number into 0. That tells you what I think about the $2,000.
Okay.
Slide 128, I suppose, has as its focus, Professor, an illustration of what you call the smoothing effect of the annuities. But before I have you take us through this figure, which is fairly straightforward, actually, could you just explain what you did with the 1912 year, or maybe more appropriately, why you did that exactly? There's a note at the bottom there. Does that matter?
It matters to what we see in this figure. this is the data that we have calculated for NCRs every year from 1850 to 2019. That's the red line is our estimates of NCRs year by year converted into present value 2020 values, so they're comparable. But then when I depict them, I leave out 1912. So 1912 was a year of a relatively large railway subsidy payment, which in our accounts appears as negative NCRs. If I include it, it changes the scale of the graph to incorporate that big negative. Everything else has to shrink together, making it harder to read, but it's still in our accounts. It's just not in this picture.
That's a visual concept. All right, can you tell us what this, what you're showing here, please?
Well, as I just said, the red line, the red series here are our estimates of annual NCRs. For other reasons, I depicted Mr. Hutchings' estimates earlier. You can see that our annual NCRs are volatile. They go up and down from year to year, just as his annual NCRs go up and down and are volatile. But you can also see that ours are very different in the post-1945 period, that we estimate that NCRs after this post-war boom in forestry in RST, NCRs then started to decline. They become negative in the 1960s, remain negative. And so they accumulate to a sum in 2019. That's a negative number. So the red line is just the NCRs. The blue line shows you the annual annuity payments that we estimate would hypothetically have been paid under our approach in each year, also in present value 2020 dollars. We calculate the annual payments in nominal terms in the way described on the prior slide. We add compound interest to convert them to 2020 dollars.
Lastly, Professor, on slide 129, you set out certain points in conclusion respecting your proposed model. Would you like to present those to Hirana, please?
Sure. So these are conclusions. I'll repeat some of what I said, I hope briefly. We think of Vidal-Anderson annuities, this approach to calculating hypothetical augmentation. We think of it as a way of fulfilling the promise, which is consistent with all the evidence we have about how that would have actually happened in reality if the treaty had been interpreted in the past in the way we're now discussing. We also think that this approach is not just historically consistent, it's better. It's better for the annuitants themselves than the alternative model presented by Mr. Hutchings and Professor Stiglitz of directly sharing the NCRs, whether large or small, year by year. In the second bullet here, I've said, which discusses this issue, I've said our approach, the Vidal-Anderson approach, provides insurance benefits. And that's a common way of economists of talking, but it may seem strange in this context. We talk about income insurance, that having smooth income accords an insurance benefit to the recipient relative to having a volatile income. And so all I'm saying here is that there would be no big swings in payments from year to year in the Vidal-Anderson annuity model, but there would be big swings from year to year under the NCR model, whether based on the estimates that Bodway and Smart provide or that Hutchings provide. They would go up and down from year to year under the joint venture model, and that would be less desirable from the point of view of annuitants. And Mr. Marcello, I might suggest it would be good to go back to the prior slide and just look at those patterns.
128?
Or no, do you mean the slide before that?
No, I mean precisely this one, Your
128?
Honor, with the
Okay.
figure, which is 128. So if NCRs were paid out, 100% of them were paid out through a joint venture model, payments would be high in some years, and they would fall down to the $2,000 minimum in some years, or indeed, as Mr. Hutchings and Professor Stiglitz have interpreted it, I don't think they don't impose that minimum payment.
Well,
So,
nor do they propose contributions from the First Nations.
well, I think for RST, they did not estimate any particular years of losses. So in that sense, the issue didn't arise for them. But everything that they wrote about it would suggest, in my opinion, that if there were losses, as we've estimated there were, then it would involve a contribution from the annuitants to the Crown.
Okay.
And in support of that, I would point out that when they describe their joint venture model, they say 84% of NCRs would be shared, without specifying that the share would be different if NCRs were negative. So the blue line shows the Vidal Anderson annuity approach. You can see what happens, I think. Initially, there would be some augmentation for RST beginning as early as 1851. If I'm reading this, forgive me. I'm going to correct myself. I'm not sure if that's true. Recall that the amounts that are being depicted in the blue line are present values, and they're relatively small. It's hard for me to see in this figure. I would have to check my work papers to see whether any augmentation was paid immediately in 1850. What's more clear is that in the early 1870s, the Vidal Anderson model does trigger an augmentation. And you see that because the blue line suddenly goes up around 1870. And that, of course, is consistent with what happened with the augmentation to $4. It occurred around the same time as we have hypothesized that this broader augmentation model would have triggered an increase. And there are a sequence of years of positive NCRs following that, which caused capital to build up in the Vidal Anderson account. So more and more augmentation will be paid out, but the blue line declines because, including interest to the present day, the more recent amounts are smaller in present value terms. So this is a gradual decline, which just reflects present value to the year 2020. That being said, we estimate that there were losses in NCRs in the early 1900s. That would be taking capital out of the Vidal Anderson account, causing the augmented annuities to gradually decline until in the early 20th century, there would be no further augmentation for a sequence of years. The annuitants would be back to the minimum payment. Then with the post-war boom or the post-depression boom, again, the capital in the account would start to climb and augmentation would have been paid again. Around World War II, the 1950s, you see the blue line starts to rise again. That's because there's now capital in the account. The interest is being paid out. And we've already talked about our estimate of the losses that started to accrue in the 1960s, which would first decrease the capital in the Vidal Anderson account, therefore decrease the interest payouts until finally there's no capital left in the account. And the annuity payments would then fall to the $2,000 minimum again. And evidently they've been there by our estimates since roughly the year 1970.
So returning then to slide 129, I think you were really discussing matters arising from the third bullet when you went back to slide 128 in the figure.
Yes.
And so do you want to wrap up anything else you have to say about this slide?
Well, bullet 4 on slide 129 simply addresses again the issue of the cumulative losses in the account. So in 2019, that notional capital account, we think describes the way the Crown would have augmented, has a negative value in it. We think it's realistic to say the Crown would have just borne that loss. They would not have attempted to recover any of those losses from the annuitants. And so that's what we do in our calculations. They post a $2,000 minimum year by year. We think that's realistic description of what the Crown would have done, as well as being ethically appropriate in this context. Yes, I apologize. I said
ethically appropriate.
as well as being ethically appropriate.
It is getting late, and that is as far as I was going to go today. Anyway, Your Honor, I would remind Professor Smart that if he can find the version of the Vidal Anderson document that he used, he will let us know. We will try to find it again.
Very good.
Seems that there might be a little bit of a difference between the one in the JBD and the one the professor used.
Okay,
Whether it really matters at the end.
May I ask, because I'm trying to minimize communication, can I email, what are your normal practices? Do I email that to Mr. Marcello? Is that what you want?
I think that's fine. Very good.
Thank you.
Okay, is that?
All right. I think we're
you.
very good. Thank you. I just want to know. So it is the May long weekend. and We're off.